you, Anna and Hugo, for that warm welcome. Let's start with the keynote and Catherine Schenk from UPIER.
Right, thank you very much, April, and it's nice to see another Canadian, so you might detect it in my accent as well. And I was happy to see the Reg of Canada is represented here today as well. I'm Catherine Schenk. I'm from the University of Oxford, and I'm leading a project that is helping to support this event. It's a project funded by the European Union and the European Commission on uses of the past in international economic relations. So we have a team of about 10 scholars based at Uppsala, at Oxford, in Madrid, and in Geneva, running through your archives, looking at how policymakers, how bankers, how international institutions looked to the past when they were reacting to particularly financial crises, but also about how reputation is built within financial markets and how the past is used to inform that. So I'm very pleased to be addressing you today. First of all, I'd like to thank Anna and her team, of course, for the wonderful organization and the hospitality that we're due to receive over the course of the couple of days here today, and of course the European Association of Banking and Financial History, and Carmen and Gabriela for their wonderful organization. I'm going to address and introduce some of the key questions for today and tomorrow's sessions. And these include: how can archives prepare their collections of information in a way that puts them to best use? How do researchers use archive collections? How can the historical records be made accessible to and exploited by a wider audience? So what makes a good bank and a good archive are the themes of the papers for today and tomorrow. Using the past to help us understand how banks originated is clearly important to understanding how they develop. It also helps to remind us the many forms of financial institutions and different models for the delivery of public services. What turns a bank from a charitable organization or a friendly cooperative to a profit-seeking organization? Do banks perform a public service by making loans and protecting deposits, which was very much in the discourse after the global financial crisis? Or should they be cautious in their lending in order to maximize profits for their shareholders? This was a major debate of the 1890s, of the 1930s, and continues today. Are loans best allocated by need or social benefit, or by the likelihood of repayment? The re-emergence of successful microfinance for poor borrowers without collateral over the past 10 to 20 years suggests that models of the past can be integrated into current financial systems. And archives obviously have a huge role to play in understanding the organization and development of financial services and the role they play in the wider economy and society. So how do researchers use archive collections? Well, accessibility is clearly an issue, and digitization has opened up a set of resources to a global public audience. In the digital age, there are high expectations of accessibility that previous generations did not have to meet. But what is selected for digitization depends in part on anticipating what will be of interest to researchers or to the public, as well as how the institution hopes to project itself. Now, the uses of archives can be difficult to predict. Academic researchers seek evidence in daily, nitty-gritty correspondence and ephemera, as well as informal minutes or accounts. The ideas that were abandoned are often at least as interesting as the plans that come to fruition and lead the bank in a particular direction. Also, evidence of the working lives of those within the banks, of the architecture, of the social and cultural service are as interesting for many researchers as the contribution of the banking system to financial or economic history. This all suggests a limit to the usefulness of digitization, since not everything from the past 300 years can be digitized. I've worked in some banks where every document that a researcher requests and selects is scanned as they go along, as a way to have kind of demand-led digitization. But this is still backward-looking rather than anticipating demand for new questions. On the other hand, researchers are normally requested not to share the digital images that they themselves make of archival material and to seek approval before publication in order to control the use of the material. So there's a lot of replication of research effort and digitization that the archive itself and other researchers can't take advantage of. But this relationship between the researcher and the archive forms part of the trust that is required between the archivist and the researcher, that the collection is being used for genuine academic research. For future researchers, of course, the challenges are how to manage digital from birth records, and this is a clear and present preoccupation of archivists here today. Most researchers will try to triangulate amongst more than one institution, so finding commensurate records and practices across banks becomes crucial, which is why events like today, where archivists come together to identify and share best interest and practice, are so important. For the researcher, the thrill of entering an archive is the expectation of a brilliant but often elusive discovery. But when that eureka moment eludes us, the way that the physical artifacts, such as paper records, bring you closer to the people and ideas of the past through marginalia, knowing that individuals created, handled, and used these records to express and develop their own ideas. This, of course, is a thrill that the public can also enjoy through careful curation of diaries, appointment books, marginalia of well-known historical characters, and by bringing to life the everyday lived experience of the many women and men who worked as clerks and cleaners, as well as high-flying financiers. The important role of women in the operations of banks and other financial institutions is particularly neglected, and archives have an important opportunity here to redress that aspect of financial history. Les Femmes qui Comptent and other kinds of programs and other initiatives are recovering this forgotten history. Are there new ways that archives can be used by financial institutions themselves as they face challenges of the present and the future? Banks and bankers came in for a considerable amount of criticism after the global financial crisis, but it's important to remember that previous crises have also led to a backlash against those who provide financial services to the public. Banks can become divorced from the public realm and public interests and concerns through the salaries that bankers command and the sophistication of the instruments they use to generate value and profit from the deposits of customers. Banks may also be seen to exploit the political and social connections that they created in order to generate these profits. Thus, the robber barons of the 19th century gave way to J.P. Morgan at the turn of the century, and then to the fat cats of the 1920s and 1930s, moving on to the gnomes of Zurich in the 1960s. But these more venal portrayals of banks and bankers reflect only a slice of the financial institutions and are most prevalent in times of crisis. At the meetings today and tomorrow, we have some examples of institutions that remained consistent to their charitable DNA, and those that took advantage of changes in regulations to enter entirely new competitive markets. In the 20th century, many institutions in the UK, like building societies or savings banks, quickly disappeared into larger financial institutions, and today the landscape of finance is probably more homogeneous than in the past. As banking systems consolidate, their archives collapse into larger and larger collections that can become difficult to manage for the archivist, but which make the job of the researcher easier. The records of failures are at least as interesting as the stories of survivors. The responsibilities of central banks for financial stability as well as price stability mean that their collections are particularly important for understanding macroeconomic policy making and international monetary cooperation, as well as the history of economic thought. Because their actions have systemic effects, they have a special burden of transparency compared to strictly private institutions. So what role do archives and historical research play in the interests of the institutions themselves? What is clear is that the past matters for banking because of the value of reputation in an environment of information asymmetry. Who to trust is often related to the origins and reputation of financial institutions and how they project their purposes and interests. How can archives help us to reflect on the legacy of the social purposes that inspired the origins of many financial institutions and the role of banks and finance today? The purely charitable financial institution has to some extent been subsumed into specialist foundations, but it still survives in cooperatives and friendly societies. Here there is often a focus on the local or regional and close connections between customers and communities. This is particularly interesting in an age of seemingly unrivaled and unfettered globalization. But these institutions must also have links to profit-seeking banks through deposits and clearing and investments. For example, many modern commercial banks have cooperated with local banks in developing economies to support microfinance by providing collateral to micro-lenders to intermediate between local banks and individual borders. This mixed model of finance certainly deserves greater understanding and will benefit from being linked to the historic roles of financial institutions within the ecosystem of their economic and financial services. How different customers should be protected and how different markets should be integrated is a key challenge for regulators, as the flip-flop from Glass-Steagall to Dodd-Frank demonstrates. Another aspect of good banks and good archives is the collections that financial institutions accumulate in the service of the public to burnish their public image or to create links with elites. Deutsche Bank, for example, embarked on a conscious strategy to collect modern German art in the 1970s, a turbulent decade for international capital markets, but a time when Deutsche Bank wanted to reflect the bank's essential German focus. Moving more deliberately into the art market coincided also with the expansion of the bank's footprint in Germany and the redevelopment of properties in Frankfurt and Dusseldorf. As well as decorating the bank's own premises, Deutsche Bank bought contemporary German art in collaboration with major public galleries, and senior executives joined the boards of prominent art institutions. In 1986, as Deutsche Bank was about to embark on its international investment banking adventures, Zapp, who was in charge of the art program, noted that, quote, "It's part of our self-image as a forward-looking and innovative bank to promote it's part of our self-image as a forward-looking and innovative bank to present modern-day artists and their works." So public works or public services promote as well as create a self-image of banks to reflect not only to external stakeholders, but also internally within what are often very complex institutions. And we'll hear today and tomorrow about other examples of charitable activities, often dubbed corporate social responsibility. Finally, the role of corporate archives in constructing reputation is clearly important for the firm itself. The archives can remind present-day employees of the origins of their institution and inspire them to think imaginatively about organizational structures and models of good banking in different social and political contexts. This reflection is required particularly at the moment as banks rebuild their reputations, reform their structures, and respond to growing social and economic inequalities. As a lover of archives, always seeking that eureka moment of discovery, I look forward to the inspiring papers to be presented today. Thank you very much.